Number 1. George Rivas. Christmas Eve in the year 2000. While the city of Irving, Texas was glowing with holiday lights and music, 7 armed men stormed into a closed Oshman's sporting goods store. They forced employees at gunpoint, gathering cash and weapons. This was the Texas 7, a group of escapees who had broken out of the Connolly unit just 11 days earlier. Leading them was George Rivas. On December 13th, Rivas had orchestrated their escape by overpowering guards, cutting through fences, stealing a vehicle, and leaving behind a taunting message, "This won't be the last time." And he was right. On Christmas Eve, while families gathered around their tables, the group struck again. At 6 that evening, police radio reported suspicious activity at Oshman's. Officer Aubrey Hawkins, 29 years old, was eating dinner with his family. He set down his fork, got in his patrol car, and drove to the scene. He pulled up at the loading dock. As he stepped out, before he could draw his weapon, the group unleashed a hail of gunfire. When it stopped, Officer Hawkins lay still on the ground. He was the first officer in Irving to lose his life in the line of duty. Behind him, he left a young wife and a 3-year-old son. The killing on Christmas Eve shocked the entire community. A nationwide manhunt began, and 6 weeks later, the case appeared on America's Most Wanted. Tips poured in. On January 23, 2001, police surrounded a campsite in Woodland Park, Colorado. 1 man took his own life. The others, including Rivas, were captured. In court, prosecutors called Rivas the mastermind. Under Texas law, when a death occurs during a felony, every participant can face the death penalty, regardless of who fired the fatal shot. The jury needed little time. Rivas was sentenced to death. On February 29, 2012, a rare leap day, George Rivas entered the death chamber in Huntsville. He had no special last meal, only the standard prison tray. When asked for final words, he turned toward Officer Hawkins' family and said, "First, to the family of Aubrey Hawkins, I am sorry for everything that happened. Not because I am here, but so that you may find closure in your hearts. I believe you deserve that." Then he looked at his wife. "Take care of yourself. I will be waiting for you. I love you." At 6:22 that evening, the procedure was complete. Irving still glowed with Christmas lights that night, but at the Hawkins family table, 1 chair would remain empty forever. George Rivas did not just lead an escape. He led his entire group into a dead end, where 1 act of violence destroyed a family's happiness and left a wound that would never heal for the entire community. Number 2. Andrew Howard Brannan. On January 12, 1998, Whipple Crossing Road in Lawrence County, Georgia, was quiet, with only the wind moving through the trees. Deputy Kyle Dinkheller, 22 years old, was nearing the end of his shift when he spotted a Toyota pickup speeding close to 100 miles an hour. He turned on his lights and pulled the vehicle over. His dashcam began recording. The driver was 49-year-old Andrew Howard Brannan, a Vietnam veteran. At first, he spoke erratically, his voice rising and falling, sometimes laughing wildly. On the video, he can be seen dancing in the road, shouting and cursing. Deputy Dinkheller kept his distance, calmly giving commands. "Step back, sir." But the tension escalated. Brannan yelled louder, challenging the deputy. Then, Brannan walked to his truck and pulled out an M1 carbine rifle. Kyle shouted, "Drop the gun!" again and again. No response. Within seconds, shots rang out. The young deputy was struck multiple times and collapsed beside his patrol car. Brannan drove away, leaving flashing lights over a silent scene. Kyle never made it home to dinner with his wife, who was pregnant, and their little daughter, just 20 months old. The dashcam captured everything. That recording became the most powerful evidence at trial. It has since been shown in police academies across the country, a grim reminder that a single moment of hesitation can cost a life. Brannan was arrested soon after. Prosecutors charged him with intentional murder. His defense attorneys emphasized his history as a veteran, with diagnoses of PTSD and bipolar disorder, arguing that he had suffered a mental breakdown. Prosecutors countered that Brannan knew exactly what he was doing and chose to pull the trigger. In 2000, the jury returned a death sentence. For more than a decade, his legal team fought for clemency, citing his mental health and military service. Deputy Dinkheller's family strongly opposed, insisting this was a cold-blooded execution, not an illness. The Georgia Parole Board ultimately denied clemency, exactly 17 years after the shooting. On January 13, 2015, at the state prison in Jackson, Brannan was served his final meal. Eggs over easy, hash browns, biscuits with gravy, sausage, a pecan waffle with strawberries, milk, apple juice, and decaf coffee. He ate most of it. As he entered the execution chamber, Brannan looked toward the Dinkheller family and said, "I extend my deepest condolences to the Dinkheller family, especially to Kyle's parents, his wife, and his 2 children." At 8:33 that evening, the lethal injection was carried out. He became the first prisoner executed in the United States in 2015. More than 25 years later, the dashcam recording is still shown. For law enforcement, it is a lasting warning. Even a routine stop can turn deadly. For the Dinkheller family, no verdict could ever replace the husband and father who left for work that day and never came home. Number 3. Carl Wayne Buntion. On a rainy June evening in 1990, a call went out on the Houston Police Radio. Unit 5, traffic stop at Airline and Lyerly. Patrol lights flashed red and blue against the wet pavement. Officer James Irby, 37 years old, had pulled over a motorcycle. The passenger was 46-year-old Carl Wayne Buntion. Without a word, Buntion stepped down. He drew a gun and fired at close range. Officer Irby had no chance to react. Other officers rushed in, but they could only watch as the gunman disappeared into the rain and flashing lights. Houston was shaken. Buntion was no stranger to police. His criminal record stretched nearly 4 decades, including theft, assaults, and offenses against minors. Prosecutors later said he was someone the system had failed to stop long ago. In 1991, he was sentenced to death. The loss of Officer Irby was not only a tragedy for his family, but also a warning about the danger of a man who should have been restrained much earlier. But the sentence was far from final. For over 30 years, Buntion's case was repeatedly appealed. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the sentencing phase, citing that the jury had not been given enough information about his age and mental health. By 2012, a new jury once again returned a death sentence. For the next decade, Buntion argued that his old age and poor health meant he was no longer dangerous. Every appeal was denied. On April 21, 2022, at the death chamber in Huntsville, 78-year-old Carl Wayne Buntion became the oldest Texas inmate ever executed. It was also the state's first execution of that year. He declined a special last meal, receiving the standard prison tray instead. Before the procedure, Buntion turned toward Officer Irby's family and said, "I want the Irby family to know one thing. I truly regret what I have done." He then joined a pastor in reciting Psalm 23. This was a new allowance under Texas law, permitting a spiritual advisor to touch the inmate in their final moments. At 6:39 that evening, his heart stopped. Outside, dozens of Houston officers stood silently, shoulder to shoulder. They came to honor a colleague who had fallen 32 years earlier. Justice had been delayed, but not denied, yet the empty space left by James Irby could never be filled, like a patrol light fading out into the night rain. Number 4. David Lee Powell, Texas, May 18, 1978. On East Live Oak Street, patrol lights illuminated a red Mustang with no license plate. Sheila Minert was behind the wheel. In the passenger seat sat David Lee Powell. Police radio confirmed the suspect might be wanted. Sergeant Ralph Ablanado of the Austin Police Department pulled them over. At first, it seemed like a routine stop, but tension rose quickly. Powell suddenly reached to the back seat and pulled out a rifle. Before Sergeant Ablanedo could react, shots were fired through the patrol car. The Mustang sped away. Only a few blocks later, officers gave chase. Powell fired again and even tossed a grenade, which by chance did not explode. When captured, he said nothing. Inside his home, investigators discovered a cache of weapons, ammunition, and a meth lab. The case had now exposed far more than a single killing. It revealed an entire criminal operation. At trial in 1978, Powell was sentenced to death. But his legal path stretched more than 3 decades. In 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned part of his sentence. He was condemned again in 1991, only for that verdict to be thrown out in 1994. By 1999, after a third trial, the death sentence was upheld. Powell went on to become one of the longest-serving inmates on Texas death row. On June 15, 2010, Huntsville Prison prepared for a highly anticipated execution. Nearly 150 Austin officers and former officers attended. Many had worn black armbands for over 30 years in memory of Sergeant Ablanedo. Powell requested a last meal of fried chicken, French fries, a Philly cheesesteak sandwich, salad, carrots, strawberry ice cream, and iced tea. When asked for final words, he shook his head and remained silent. At 6:19 that evening, the lethal injection was carried out. Outside, Sergeant Ablanedo's family stood among the officers, silently witnessing the conclusion. Justice had taken decades, but the case was finally closed. Powell left the world in silence, just as he had kept for over 30 years. But the name of Sergeant Ralph Ablanedo lives on, engraved on the police memorial wall. Killed in the line of duty. Number 5. Edgar Arias Tamayo. Houston, a January night in 1994. In the back of a squad car sat 2 handcuffed suspects. One of them was Edgar Arias Tamayo, a Mexican national, just arrested after a nightclub robbery. Officers had searched him but missed a small handgun hidden on his body. Driving the patrol car was Officer Guy Patrick Gaddis, only 24 years old. He was transporting the suspects to jail, unaware that the ride would end in tragedy. Tamayo leaned, pulled the gun, and fired. The car veered out of control and crashed into a house. Amid the chaos, Tamayo ran across a lawn into the night, but he did not get far. He was captured nearby. In 1994, a Harris County jury sentenced him to death. But the case reached far beyond Houston. Because Tamayo was a Mexican citizen and police had not informed him of his right to consular access under the Vienna Convention, the trial drew international attention. In 2004, the International Court of Justice listed Tamayo among 51 Mexican nationals whose cases required review. The Mexican government protested. At times, even the U.S. State Department called for a delay. But in Texas, the execution date moved forward. Every appeal, including at the U.S. Supreme Court, was denied. On January 22, 2014, at Huntsville Prison, Tamayo walked into the death chamber wearing a white uniform. There was no last meal. Texas had abolished that practice in 2011. When asked for final words, he shook his head. At 9:32 that evening, the sentence was carried out. Outside, Officer Gaddis's family embraced, mourning the loss of a young man taken at just 24. In Mexico City, officials declared the execution proof that the United States had ignored international commitments. But for the Gaddis family, legal arguments were only distant noise. The only truth that mattered was this: a young officer never came home, and the void left behind would last forever. Number 6. Torrey Twane McNabb. On the evening of September 24, 1997, Rosa Parks Avenue in Montgomery, Alabama was blocked by a car accident. Standing nearby was a 20-year-old named Torrey Twane McNabb, who had just fled a bail bondsman. He still carried a loaded handgun. Only a few feet away, Corporal Anderson Gordon III, 30 years old, sat in his patrol car monitoring the scene. McNabb raised his weapon and fired directly through the windshield. Corporal Gordon collapsed at the wheel, never touching his holster. By the time other officers arrived, McNabb had disappeared. The scene held only shattered glass, shell casings, and a fallen officer. Hours later, McNabb was captured in a nearby house. The gun matched, witnesses identified him, and he showed no sign of remorse. At trial in 1999, prosecutors described him as someone who treated killing an officer like a trophy. The jury deliberated less than a day before convicting him of first-degree murder and recommending death by a vote of 10-2. Still, McNabb lived nearly 2 more decades through appeals. His lawyers argued that Alabama's use of midazolam in lethal injections risked extreme pain. The courts rejected each claim. On October 19, 2017, at Holman Prison, McNabb skipped both breakfast and dinner. As he entered the death chamber, he looked at the witnesses and said, "Mom and Sis, I'm unafraid." Then, turning to the officials, he declared coldly, "I hate you." His final act was to raise his middle finger in defiance. At 8:56 that night, the injection began. Witnesses said he continued moving for several minutes. Attorneys argued it proved their warnings about midazolam. At 9:38, all movement ceased. As his body was taken away, many remembered Corporal Gordon lying motionless in his patrol car, his silver badge still on the seat. Number 7. Kevin Johnson, Jr. Kirkwood, Missouri. The night of July 5, 2005. The echoes of Independence Day fireworks still hung in the air, blending with the static of police radios. On Alsobrook Street, Sergeant William McEntee, 43 years old, had just finished handling a neighborhood disturbance. He did not know that within minutes, his life would end. Earlier that day, officers had gone to arrest Kevin Johnson, Jr. for a probation violation. During the confrontation, Johnson's 12-year-old brother suffered a severe asthma attack and died on the way to the hospital. Johnson believed police had ignored him. From grief came a surge of anger that consumed his judgment. That evening, when Sergeant McEntee returned to the neighborhood, Johnson saw the patrol car near his home. He approached, opened the passenger door, and fired multiple shots inside. The car rolled nearly 200 feet before hitting a tree. Witnesses testified that Johnson fired again after the vehicle stopped, then walked away under flashing red and blue lights. Forensic reports confirmed 7 bullets struck Sergeant McEntee, ending his life instantly. At trial in 2007, prosecutors argued it was an act of revenge, deliberately aimed at a police officer. Johnson claimed he acted in pain and lost control after his brother's death. For more than 15 years, his attorneys appealed. They cited racial bias in prosecution, requested his daughter be present at the end, and even gained support from a special prosecutor who asked for a delay. All petitions were denied. On November 29, 2022, at the death chamber in Bonne Terre, Missouri, Johnson refused a last meal. He remained silent as a pastor read Psalm 23. At 7:40 that evening, pentobarbital was injected. His heartbeat slowed, then stopped. Outside the prison, 2 groups faced one another. On one side stood Sergeant McEntee's family and friends, holding his photo. On the other side were death penalty opponents, holding banners for mercy. When the announcement came, "Kevin Johnson, Jr. has been executed," no one spoke. There was only silence. For the McEntee family, it was the end of a 17-year wait. For Johnson's supporters, it was proof of a justice system too rigid for compassion. Number 8. Manuel Valle. On April 2, 1978, in Coral Gables, Florida, a Chevrolet Camaro ran a red light. Officer Louis Pena and his partner Gary Spell spotted it. Radio confirmed the vehicle was stolen. Officer Pena, a veteran K-9 handler, pulled it over. His dog Abe barked loudly from the back cage. The driver, 28-year-old Manuel Valle, stepped out and asked to return to his car for cigarettes. Instead of a pack, he pulled a gun. One shot struck Officer Pena fatally. 2 more bullets flew toward Officer Spell, stopped only by his vest. Valle fled, leaving behind the sound of barking and a fallen partner. 2 days later, police caught him. The death sentence came quickly, but the road to the execution chamber stretched more than 30 years. In 1981, the ruling was overturned because his attorney had too little time to prepare. He was retried and sentenced to death again. In 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the sentencing phase. By 1988, a jury voted 8-4 to send Valle back to death row. For 33 years, the Pena family waited. Each scheduled execution was delayed by appeals. In 2011, Governor Rick Scott signed the final warrant. By then, Florida had switched its first injection drug from sodium thiopental to pentobarbital. Valle's attorneys argued the change might cause pain, but state and federal courts rejected the claim. On September 28, 2011, at Florida State Prison, light rain fell outside. The execution was delayed at 4 p.m. as the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed his final appeal. At 6:30, the denial came. An hour later, the process began. Valle's last meal: fried chicken, white rice, garlic bread, peach cobbler, and Coca-Cola. He ate most of it, but offered no words, no glance toward Officer Pena's family. At 7:14 that evening, pentobarbital ended his life. He became the first Florida inmate executed with that drug. For the Pena family, 33 years of waiting closed in a moment. But it was not joy. Sometimes the deepest pain lies not only in the execution chamber, but in how time and bureaucracy can fade the memory of those who gave everything. Number 9. William Morva. Late at night at Montgomery Regional Hospital, fluorescent lights reflected off tile floors. 24-year-old William Morva, jailed for robbery charges, complained of breathing issues and was taken to medical. But instead of receiving care, he attacked Deputy Russell Quesenberry with a metal object, knocking him out and stealing his pistol. Hospital security guard Derek McFarland, 32 years old, rushed in to help. A gunshot ended his life instantly. Morva escaped into the night. By morning, the town of Blacksburg was on high alert. Dozens of officers searched the area. On the Huckleberry Trail, Corporal Eric Sutphin, 40 years old, crossed paths with Morva while jogging. Gunfire ended the veteran officer's life on the very trail he loved. Within 24 hours, the manhunt was over. Morva was found under a bridge, exhausted and surrendering. At trial in 2008, his attorneys argued he suffered from delusional disorder, believing conspiracies targeted him. Prosecutors countered, regardless of mental state, 2 people were dead. The jury returned a death sentence for both killings. For nearly a decade, appeals centered on his mental illness. By 2017, more than 7,300 signatures came in from around the world, including the United Nations, the European Union, and even Hungary, his father's homeland, asking for clemency. Remarkably, Rachel Sutphin, daughter of Corporal Sutphin, also pleaded for mercy. Every appeal was denied. On July 6, 2017, at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia, Morva entered the death chamber. When asked for final words, he replied simply, "No." At 9:15 that evening, the clock stopped. 3 years later, Virginia abolished the death penalty, a change Morva never lived to see. But in Blacksburg, the memory of the shootings still lingers on Huckleberry Trail, where 2 men lost their lives. The questions of justice and mercy remain, reminding us that behind every execution are lives that can never return. Number 10. Earl Forrest. On December 9, 2002, in Dent County, Missouri, Earl Forrest drove to the home of Harriet Smith. He wanted to reclaim items from a past drug deal. The argument turned violent. Forrest drew his gun, fatally shooting Harriet and her friend, Michael Wells. The wooden house instantly became a crime scene. Forrest returned home, cold and unshaken. Soon, Sheriff Bob Wofford and Chief Deputy Sharon Joanne Barnes, 48 years old, arrived at Forrest's house. When the door opened, Forrest opened fire. Deputy Barnes fell, Sheriff Wofford was wounded, and Forrest's girlfriend was also struck. The shootout lasted minutes. The toll was devastating. 3 people dead, 2 more injured, and a community in shock. Forrest surrendered, showing no fear. In 2004, he went to trial. Prosecutors described his actions as deliberate and calculated. The jury agreed. He received 3 death sentences, 1 for each victim. Appeals failed. Forrest showed no remorse, no request for mercy. On May 11, 2016, at Bonne Terre Prison in Missouri, Forrest ate his final meal: steak, pasta, fruit, tomatoes, cucumbers, chocolate cake, and milk. When asked for last words, he remained silent. At 7:18 that evening, pentobarbital was administered. Minutes later, Forrest was gone. Outside, Chief Deputy Barnes's family held one another. Her daughter later told reporters, "My mother gave her life doing what she believed was right. No sentence can bring her back, but at least we know justice was carried out." For Dent County, the memory of that day still lingers. Earl Forrest left without a word. 3 lives were lost, and the void he created could never be filled.